Charlotte Hayes pressed Benjamin so hard against her chest that he stopped crying. Not because he was comforted, because her arms were shaking so badly she had accidentally squeezed the breath out of him, and the shock of it made him go still, eyes wide, searching her face for a reason to be afraid. She gave him one without meaning to her own face, white as bleached cotton, staring out at the crowd gathered in the center of Red Creek, like she was already looking at something she couldn't survive. The auctioneer's voice rolled over the square like a man selling livestock. "Widow woman, 3 dependents, sound body, able hands. Who'll open at $10? The laughter started in the back and moved forward like a wave. If you are watching this story right now, I want to ask you something before we go any further. When was the last time someone stood up for a woman that the whole world had already decided wasn't worth saving? Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens on this mountain is going to stay with you. And when you're done, I want you to drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. If this channel has found its way to your screen and you haven't subscribed yet, please do it right now. Every single person who clicks that button tells me that stories like Charlotte's deserve to be heard. Now let's go back to Red Creek, Montana. The summer of 1888, and a woman standing on a wooden platform with her baby in her arms and her daughters pressed against her legs, about to be sold. The platform was only 3 steps off the ground, but it felt like the edge of a cliff. Charlotte had stood on it for 11 minutes, she knew, because she had counted every second the way you count when you are trying not to scream. Emily stood to her left, 8 years old and already understanding too much, her small jaw set in an expression that shouldn't exist on a child's face. Lucy stood to her right with both fists buried in Charlotte's skirt, her face turned in against her mother's hip so she didn't have to look at the crowd. Benjamin had stopped crying. That almost made it worse. "Come on now, she's got 2 working arms and a strong back," the auctioneer said, and a man in the front row said something that made the 3 men beside him laugh, and Charlotte looked straight ahead at the mountains, because looking at the mountains meant she didn't have to look at any of them. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since the sheriff had knocked on her door at dawn and told her about the wagon accident on the Bozeman Pass. 6 weeks since she had learned one horrible document at a time that Thomas had borrowed against everything they owned: the land, the livestock, the cabin, and that every penny of it was owed to a man named Hargrove, who had no interest in patience, and even less in mercy. 6 weeks since the first letter arrived explaining that if she could not cover the debt in full, the county had the legal authority to liquidate her assets, including under the 1887 territorial labor provision, her labor itself. She hadn't understood that last part until Reverend Elkins explained it to her with his eyes on the floor and his hat in his hands. The provision had been written for men, but no one had bothered to write an exception. $40, said a voice from the left side of the crowd, and Charlotte's stomach turned to water because she recognized it before she found the face. Clyde Mercer. He was standing with his thumbs in his belt with the particular ease of a man who had already decided how this was going to end. He ran the biggest saloon in Red Creek and 2 others in the valley, and he had been looking at Charlotte Hayes for 3 years with an expression that made her cross to the other side of any street he was on. $40. The auctioneer repeated, and the tone in his voice changed slightly, the professional shift from performance to transaction. "Do I hear 45? Silence. Charlotte pressed her lips together. She would not give them tears. She had decided that before she climbed the steps. Whatever happened on this platform, she would not give this crowd the satisfaction of watching her come apart. "Children, stay with the woman," someone called from the middle of the crowd. "Terms are at the buyer's discretion," the auctioneer said, and Emily made a sound beside her, barely a sound, more like the beginning of one immediately swallowed, and Charlotte felt it in her spine like a blade. "Separate the baby," Clyde Mercer said, still casual, still easy. "I don't need the infant. Someone else can deal with that." "You can't." Charlotte's voice came out before she could stop it, sharp and cracked at the edges. "You cannot separate him from me. He's 3 months old. He cannot—" "Ma'am," the auctioneer said in a tone that meant, "Stop talking," and Charlotte stopped because Emily had reached out and found her hand in the folds of her skirt and was holding it with both of hers, and that small grip was the only thing keeping her upright. "$40 for the woman and the two girls," Clyde said. "Someone else deal with the baby." "$40 going once," the auctioneer said and lifted the hammer. The hammer came up. Lucy buried her face harder into Charlotte's hip and said, "Mama," in the very small voice she used when she was too frightened for anything else, and Charlotte looked at the mountains again, and the mountains didn't answer, and the hammer started to fall. "How much for all four?" The voice came from the back of the square. It wasn't loud. That was the strange thing about it. It wasn't a shout. It didn't carry the way you'd expect a voice to carry when it stops an entire crowd cold. It was level and flat, and certain the voice of a man who didn't repeat himself because he didn't expect to need to. And the crowd did go cold. It went quiet all at once, the way a room goes quiet when something walks into it that changes the air. The auctioneer lowered the hammer. People turned. At the far end of the square, at the edge where the main street dissolved into the trail that wound north toward the mountains, a man sat on a horse the color of coal. He was enormous, broad through the shoulder, in a way that made the horse look almost proportionate, dressed in worn buckskin and trail dust, with a dark beard that hadn't met a razor in weeks, and eyes that were doing something the distance made hard to read. He wasn't moving toward the platform. He was just sitting there, waiting, the reins loose in one hand. "I said how much for all four?" Still that same flat voice. "That's Gideon Blackwood," someone near Charlotte said in a low voice, and she heard the shift in the crowd, felt it, the way you feel a weather change before the sky shows it. Whispers moving like water. She didn't know the name. She didn't know what the name meant. But she could read the whispers, and what they meant was that this man was known, and that what was known about him was not entirely comfortable. "Mr. Blackwood." The auctioneer had recovered himself. "Current bid is $40 for the woman and the older children." The infant. "I don't care about the current bid." The man moved the horse forward, slow and unhurried, and the crowd parted for him without appearing to decide to. "I asked what it takes to buy all four. The woman, the two girls, and the baby, together. What's the number?" Clyde Mercer had turned around. He was studying Blackwood with the careful expression of a man doing arithmetic. "You rode down off Bitter Peak to buy yourself a ready-made family, Gideon." "I rode down for supplies." Blackwood stopped the horse about 20 feet from the platform. Up close, Charlotte could see the details she'd missed at distance, the scar that ran from his left jaw down his neck, the way his hands were still but not relaxed, the particular stillness of a man who had learned to be quiet the way some men learn a trade. He looked at Clyde Mercer for exactly 1 second, then looked at the auctioneer. "The number, 75, covers the full debt and the county fee," the auctioneer said. Blackwood reached into the saddlebag at his left hip and pulled out a leather pouch and held it out to the side without looking away from the auctioneer. "There's 110 in there. 75 for the debt, 30 for the county, 5 for your trouble. Count it if you need to." A boy from the front row ran forward and took the pouch, and the crowd watched in silence as the auctioneer opened it and counted. And the silence was the kind that has a quality to it, a specific texture, the silence of people witnessing something they don't have a category for yet. "It's good," the auctioneer said finally. "Then we're done here," Blackwood said. Charlotte had not moved. She was still standing on the platform with Benjamin in her arms and Lucy clinging to her skirt and Emily's hand locked around hers, and she was looking at the man on the black horse and trying to understand what had just happened, and whether it was better or worse than what had almost happened, and finding that she genuinely did not know. Clyde Mercer took 2 steps toward the horse. "Now hold on. I had a standing bid. You had $40 on the table." Blackwood looked at him again that same 1 second. "I had 110. Auction's over, Clyde." "This isn't finished," Mercer said. "It is for today." Blackwood finally turned his attention to the platform. He looked at Charlotte directly, and his expression was not warm. It was not the expression of a man arriving at a rescue in a story, not soft or reassuring, or performing anything for the crowd around him. It was just direct, straightforward. like he was seeing her clearly and had already made a decision and was waiting for her to catch up. "Ma'am," he said, "my name's Gideon Blackwood. I have a cabin 80 miles north up the Bitter Peak Trail. I am not going to hurt you or your children. If you want proof of that, I can't give you much more than my word at present, but I'll tell you what I can tell you. That man behind me will not stop at $40, and the county won't interfere with what he does after he's paid his money. You understand what I'm saying?" Charlotte understood. She had understood the moment she saw Clyde Mercer raise his hand. Emily looked up at her. The question on her daughter's face was not, "Are you sure not?" "Is this safe?" Emily was too old for 8 and had understood too much for too long to ask questions like that. The question on Emily's face was, "Do you need me to be brave right now?" And Charlotte felt something break quietly in the back of her chest. "Yes," she said, to Emily. To the question she hadn't been asked out loud. She stepped down off the platform. She walked toward the man on the black horse with her son against her heart and her daughters behind her. And she did not look at the crowd, and she did not look at Clyde Mercer, and she did not let her hands shake where anyone could see them. Gideon Blackwood stepped down from his horse without being asked and held the stirrup toward her. "It's a long ride. You should take the horse." "What about you?" "I'll walk." 80 miles, Charlotte said. "I've done it before." She studied his face for a moment. She was looking for the thing that was hidden in it, the cost, the condition. The thing that came later, when no one was watching. She had learned to look for that thing the hard way, and she was good at finding it. She didn't find it. That frightened her almost as much as everything else. "Emily," she said quietly, "take your sister's hand." She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the horse, settling Benjamin against her with practiced ease, and Gideon Blackwood handed her the reins without comment, and they left Red Creek in the long gold light of a Montana afternoon, with the crowd watching and nobody saying anything, and Charlotte kept her eyes forward and her jaw set, and told herself that whatever this was, she had survived worse. She wasn't sure she believed that yet, but she told herself anyway. The trail out of town climbed north through dry grass and scattered pine, the mountains growing larger and more specific ahead of them. Not the abstract blue shapes they'd been from the auction platform, but real things with rock faces and shadow, and the particular cold smell of altitude that reached down even into the valley heat. Gideon walked beside the horse. He didn't speak. Charlotte found that she didn't know what to make of the silence, whether it was the silence of a man with nothing to say, or the silence of a man who had decided not to say it yet. Emily walked close to her mother's stirrup. Lucy had finally let go of Charlotte's skirt and was walking in small, determined steps, watching the ground with the focused concentration of a child who is pretending she is not afraid by paying very close attention to her own feet. After about 2 miles, Lucy stumbled on a root and sat down hard in the trail dust and started to cry. Not the operatic crying of a child performing distress, but the small, helpless crying of pure exhaustion, the kind that happens when a child has been holding everything together for too long, and the smallest thing finally opens the seam. Charlotte started to pull on the reins, but Gideon was already there. He stopped, looked at Lucy, and crouched down to her level, a significant undertaking for a man his size, and waited. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak immediately, just waited. Lucy looked at him with red eyes and a trembling lip. "Your feet hurt," he said. A small nod. "Mine too," he said. He wasn't lying. He'd been walking since before dawn. "You want to ride for a while?" Lucy looked up at her mother. Charlotte gave her a small nod. The child looked back at Gideon, and after a long moment, held up her arms in the gesture that means, "Pick me up." That is the same in every language. He picked her up. He settled her against his shoulder and stood back up to his full height, and kept walking. And Lucy, after about 30 seconds of stiff uncertainty, leaned her head against the side of his neck and closed her eyes. Charlotte watched this and said nothing. Emily moved closer to her mother's stirrup and said very quietly, "Do you think he's actually bad?" "I don't know yet," Charlotte said. "I'm watching." "Me too," Emily said. The mountain trail narrowed as the afternoon stretched long and the shadows grew. Gideon stopped twice to fill the water canteen from a creek, holding it up to Charlotte first before drinking himself, and once to adjust the load on the saddlebag when something shifted and started rubbing the horse's flank. He noticed that before Charlotte did. That told her something, though she wasn't sure yet what. Benjamin woke and needed feeding, and Charlotte looked at the man walking a careful 10 feet ahead of them and said, "I need a minute." "Take your time," Gideon said without turning around. He walked a little further ahead and found something to look at in the middle distance. Charlotte fed her son at the side of the trail, with the mountains going gold in the evening light, and Emily sat beside her, and somewhere ahead of them, a man who had spent his last gold on 4 strangers was standing very deliberately, not looking in their direction. And Charlotte thought about all the men she had known in her life, and tried to figure out where to put this one. She couldn't yet. That night they stopped in a hollow, where the trail widened near a rock overhang. Gideon built a fire without being asked, and pulled a piece of oilcloth from the saddlebag and spread it on the ground near the warmth and said, "For the children," in the same tone he said everything else, flat and factual, no expectation attached. He gave Emily the last of the jerked beef from his pack. He sat on the far side of the fire himself and ate nothing. "You should eat," Charlotte said. "I'm all right. You've been walking since morning." He looked at her across the fire. "I've been out of provisions since 2 days back, ma'am. That was the last of it. It's no loss." Charlotte looked at the empty saddlebag and at the man who had given everything in it to her children, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she shifted Benjamin and said, "I have hardtack in my coat pocket. I've had it for 3 days. It won't be good." "It'll be fine," he said. She handed it across the fire. He broke it in half and tried to hand half back. "Eat it," she said. He ate it. Lucy was already asleep against Emily's side. Benjamin was drifting. The fire was small, but it was warm, and for the first time in 6 weeks, Charlotte felt the particular quality of air that she had almost forgotten the air in a place where for this specific hour nothing bad was happening. She looked at Gideon Blackwood across the small fire. "Why?" she said. He looked up. "At the auction. You didn't know us. You spent everything you had. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man searching for words, the quiet of a man deciding whether the words were any of her business. Then he said, "I know what Clyde Mercer does with women he owns." "So it was charity," Charlotte said. The word came out flatter than she intended. "No," he said. "Charity is when you can afford it." He looked back at the fire. "I couldn't afford it, but I did it anyway. I reckon that's something different." Charlotte thought about that for a long time after he lay down on the far side of the fire with his back to them and his coat over his shoulders. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay beside her children and listened to the night sounds of the mountain, the wind in the pine, the far-off something that might have been a wolf, or might have been the wind in a gap in the rock. And she held Benjamin and thought about a man who had done something he couldn't afford, because he knew what waited for her at the bottom of it. She didn't trust him. She wasn't close to trusting him. But she thought about what Emily had said on the trail. "Do you think he's actually bad?" And Charlotte looked at the man sleeping across the dying fire and thought, "I am still watching." She was still watching. And so far, every hour, every mile, every small thing she saw was making the answer harder to find. They reached Bitter Peak on the 3rd day. Charlotte knew they were close before Gideon said anything because she felt it in the way he changed the set of his shoulders, loosened by a fraction. His steps came surer on the trail, and once, just once, he glanced back at the cabin site ahead with the expression of a man who had been away longer than he intended. It was the most human thing she had seen on his face since Red Creek. The cabin was smaller than she had imagined and larger than she had feared. One room, heavy log walls, a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall, a single window facing east. A sleeping loft accessible by a ladder built into the wall. A cast-iron stove that had been good once and still worked by the look of it. A table, 2 chairs. A bed in the corner that was clearly sized for one person and had not been made in some time. That was everything. Charlotte stood in the doorway with Benjamin on her hip and looked at it and said nothing. "I know it's not much," Gideon said behind her. It's solid, she said, because it was. The logs were fitted tight. The roof didn't sag. Whatever else it lacked, it wasn't going to fall down. Where do you sleep? I'll take the barn. That's not... It's fine, he said. I've slept in worse. Emily had already moved past both of them and was walking the perimeter of the room with her hands clasped behind her back like a small surveyor examining the shelves, the fireplace, the loft ladder. Lucy stood just inside the threshold, looking at the space with careful eyes. Then she walked to the corner near the stove, sat down on the floor, and announced, "This is my spot." Gideon looked at her. "All right," he said. That was the first night. Gideon brought in firewood without being asked, showed Charlotte where the well was and where the smokehouse was, and told her there was jerked venison in it that should last another 2 weeks, and then he went to the barn and did not come back until morning. Charlotte lay in the bed with Benjamin tucked against her left side, and Lucy pressed against her right, and Emily in the loft above, and she listened to the mountain silence, which was not actually silent at all. Wind and pine, and the occasional shift of the horse in the barn, and she thought, this is the first night I have not been afraid of what is behind the door. She did not know what to do with that. The days that followed had a structure to them that built itself without any of them deciding on it. Gideon rose before the sun. Charlotte rose shortly after. She had found flour and salt and a tin of lard on the shelf, and the first morning she made biscuits on the cast-iron stove, and when Gideon came in from the barn, the smell hit him, and he stopped in the doorway, and for a full 3 seconds, he did not move. "Sit down," Charlotte said without turning from the stove. He sat down. She put a plate in front of him. He ate 4 biscuits without speaking. Then he said, "I haven't had biscuits since," and stopped. "Since when?" Emily asked from her spot at the end of the table. "Long time," he said. Emily accepted this and went back to her biscuit. Charlotte watched the side of his face from across the room and filed it away the way the sentence had ended mid-air, the way he had decided not to finish it. A wound there somewhere. She didn't push. The second day, Charlotte found a problem she hadn't anticipated. Benjamin was 3 months old, and she was his only source of food, and her body was running low on everything it needed because she had not eaten properly in 6 weeks. She knew the signs. She knew what happened next if nothing changed. She said nothing about it, because she was not in the habit of saying things like that out loud. But that morning when she was feeding Benjamin in the corner of the cabin, she heard the barn door, and then the sound of Gideon's boots on the path, going away from the cabin, going down toward the lower trail. He came back 3 hours later with a young goat on a lead. He didn't explain. He tied the goat in the barn, came back inside, looked at Charlotte and said, "There's a family 2 miles down the south face. They breed them. The milk should help." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She had not said a word about the feeding problem. Not to him, not to Emily, not to anyone. "How did you know?" she said. He looked briefly uncomfortable. I've been around. When a woman has a young baby and hasn't been eating right, there are signs." He seemed to decide that was enough explanation. "It's just a goat," he said, and went back outside. Emily appeared at Charlotte's elbow. "He noticed," she said, quiet and factual. "I know," Charlotte said. "Thomas never noticed things like that." Charlotte didn't answer. But she didn't disagree. By the end of the first week, the cabin had changed in ways that were hard to itemize, but impossible to miss. Charlotte had found a second blanket in a chest under the loft and aired it out. Emily had swept the floor twice. Lucy had designated 3 separate territories as her personal domain: the corner by the stove, the second step of the loft ladder, and a flat rock just outside the front door that caught the morning sun. She spent portions of each day in each of these spots with the serious proprietary air of a small land baron. Gideon watched all of this with an expression that Charlotte had begun to learn to read. He was not a man whose face moved much, but there were small tells, the slight loosening around his eyes, when something amused him, the way his jaw set, when something bothered him, the particular stillness he went into when he was listening to something more carefully than he wanted to appear to be. He was listening carefully most of the time. She had learned that. On the 9th day, the incident with the axe happened. Gideon had been splitting wood outside, and Emily had wandered over and stood watching him with her arms folded and her head tilted the way she watched everything she was trying to understand. He split 6 logs without acknowledging her. Then he stopped, looked at her and said, "You want to try?" Emily's chin came up immediately. "Yes." "You ever split wood before?" "No." "All right." He set a small log upright on the block, positioned the hatchet. Not the full axe, the smaller one in Emily's hands, adjusted her grip twice, then stepped back. "Hit the center. Let the weight do the work." Emily swung and missed completely, and the hatchet buried itself in the dirt. "Try again," Gideon said. She tried again. Hit the edge. The log skittered sideways. Again. On the 4th try, she split it clean, and the 2 halves fell apart in the dirt, and Emily looked at them and then at Gideon and said, "Again." Before he could say anything, and he handed her another log, and Charlotte watched from the window as her 8-year-old daughter split 4 more pieces of wood, with a mountain man coaching her in a flat, patient voice that adjusted its instruction every single time without a trace of frustration. She put her forehead briefly against the window frame. Something was happening here. She didn't know what to call it, and she didn't trust it, and she was watching it happen with both hands braced like a woman standing in a current that she couldn't tell yet was safe to wade into. The first time Lucy spoke to him voluntarily, it was a Thursday. Charlotte was in the barn with the goat, and Emily was in the loft, reading the single book Gideon owned, a battered almanac from 1881, and Lucy had been sitting in her spot by the stove when she apparently decided something, because she got up and walked out to the woodpile where Gideon was stacking and stood behind him and waited. He turned around and found her there and went very still. Lucy held up a flat gray rock she had been carrying in her pocket since the 3rd day on the trail. It was smooth and slightly oval and had a vein of white quartz running through the middle. "I found this on the trail," she said. "It's the best rock." Gideon looked at the rock. He looked at it seriously, with the full consideration it apparently deserved. Then he crouched down and held out his hand, and Lucy put the rock in his palm, and he turned it over and looked at the quartz vein and said, "That's feldspar and quartz. See this white line? That means this rock came from way up high where the mountains are really old." Lucy looked at the rock and then at him. "How old?" "Older than anything." She thought about this. "Older than you." He almost smiled. Charlotte saw it from the barn doorway, the very edge of it there and gone. "Yeah," he said. "Older than me." Lucy reclaimed her rock satisfied and went back inside. Gideon stayed crouched for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the ground with the expression of a man who has been handed something he wasn't expecting to receive. Charlotte stepped back into the barn before he could look up. It was during the 2nd week that Gideon made the mistake, and Charlotte saw for the first time what lived underneath the stillness. He had been to the lower valley for supplies and had come back with a paper from the Red Creek Register. He left it on the table, and Charlotte read it while she was nursing Benjamin, and the paragraph in the lower left corner of the front page stopped the breath in her chest. Local creditor pursues outstanding claim. Read the heading, and below it, Hargrove's attorney had filed a secondary claim against the Hayes estate, arguing that the county auction had not fully settled the debt, because labor value could not be transferred via auction under current statute, and that Charlotte Hayes remained personally liable for the outstanding balance of $47. She was reading it for the 3rd time when Gideon came back inside. She looked up. "Did you read this?" He had the look of a man who had been hoping to have a conversation differently than this. "Yes." "How long have you known?" "I picked up the paper this morning." "And you left it on the table?" "I wasn't going to hide it from you." Charlotte set Benjamin down in the blanket nest on the bed and stood up, and the air in the cabin changed. Emily, with her particular radar, took Lucy's hand, and the 2 of them went up the loft ladder without being asked. $47, Charlotte said. "I know." "We don't have $47. "I know that too." He pulled out the chair and sat down, which she had learned meant he was preparing for a real conversation rather than a short one. Hargrove's attorney is working an angle. The claim is questionable. The auction should have covered it. But questionable doesn't mean they won't pursue it, and pursue it means... It means they can come here, Charlotte said. They can try. Gideon. She said his name for the first time without thinking about it, and it landed in the room between them a little differently than she expected it to. She noticed. She thought he noticed too. If they come with a legal order, you can't just... I'm not going to let them take you back to Hargrove, he said, flat and simple. Not a declaration, just a fact, the way he stated most things. You don't get to decide that. No, he said. But I can make it complicated for anyone who tries. And I know a man in Billings who knows the territorial law better than Hargrove's attorney does. I'm going to write to him. He paused. I was going to tell you all of this when I'd thought it through a little more. Tell me when you know, Charlotte said. Not when you've decided. Tell me when you know. He looked at her directly. Fair enough, he said. She sat back down. The tension in the room shifted from confrontation to something else. Something that needed a name. She wasn't going to give it yet. $47, she said again more quietly. I'll handle it. We'll handle it, she said. I'm not a passenger in this. Something in his face moved, small but real. No, he said. You're not. The letter went to Billings the next morning with a rider Gideon paid to take it. Charlotte didn't ask how much it cost. She watched him come back from the trail with empty hands and the particular look of a man who has just done the thing he could think of and is now waiting. And she went inside and made coffee and put a cup on the table and didn't make anything of it, and he sat down and drank it without making anything of it either. 3 days later, Benjamin laughed for the first time. They were all at the table for the evening meal, and Gideon was doing something Charlotte had never seen him do before. He was talking. Not information, not logistics, not problem-solving. He was telling a story, a strange and wandering account of the time he had tried to move a beehive and the sequence of bad decisions that had followed, and Emily was asking sharp, delighted questions. And Lucy was laughing in her high, surprised laugh that she reserved for things that caught her completely off guard. And in the middle of it, Benjamin, who had been propped against Charlotte's arm, watching Gideon's face with the intense focus of an infant who has identified an interesting object, produced a laugh. A real one. Belly deep and shocked sounding, as if he'd surprised himself. Everyone stopped. Gideon looked at the baby. Benjamin laughed again, looking directly at him. The expression that moved across Gideon Blackwood's face in that moment was not something Charlotte could have described. It was too many things at once, surprise, and something almost like pain, and something else entirely that had no business being on the face of a man who had spent a decade trying not to feel anything. He recovered in about 3 seconds, but Charlotte had seen it. She looked back down at her plate. He likes your story, Emily said, practical as always. Apparently, Gideon said, and his voice was only slightly different from usual. Charlotte kept her eyes on her plate and thought about what she had just seen and felt something shift in the foundation of the careful, reasonable distance she had been maintaining for 14 days. Not collapsing, shifting. The way ground shifts before it decides which direction to settle. She had been watching the way she told Emily she was watching the way she had been watching since Red Creek. Looking for the hidden thing, the cost, the condition, the thing that revealed itself later. 14 days. 80 miles of trail, and 2 weeks of mornings, and every small thing she had seen. And she had not found it. That was the thing that kept her awake that night long after the cabin went quiet, and the fire burned to coals, and the mountain settled into its deep, particular darkness. Not the $47 claim, not Hargrove's attorney, not the 100 complicated practical problems that had no solution yet. Those she could hold. Those had shapes. What kept her awake was the absence of what she had been looking for. What kept her awake was a man who slept in a barn so her children could have a bed, who noticed things she hadn't said out loud, who bought a goat instead of explaining himself. who looked at her infant son's first laugh with an expression like grief and wonder stitched together. What kept her awake was the growing, terrifying, completely inconvenient possibility that Gideon Blackwood did not have a hidden thing. That what she saw was what was there. She rolled onto her side and pulled Benjamin closer, and listened to Lucy's small, even breathing, and Emily's occasional sleep murmur from the loft above, and she thought about a man telling a story about bees to make children laugh, and she thought, I am still watching. But the watching was starting to feel like something else. She didn't have a name for it yet. She was careful with names. She had learned the hard way what it cost to name something too soon. But she was running out of reasons to keep calling it nothing. The storm came without much warning, the way the worst things always do. 3 weeks into their life on Bitter Peak, the sky turned the particular yellow-gray that Gideon had learned over 10 years to read like a second language, and he came inside in the middle of the afternoon and said, "We've got maybe 2 hours," and started moving with the focused efficiency of a man who had survived mountain weather by taking it seriously. Charlotte was already moving. She had grown up in Wyoming, and she knew that color in the sky. She handed Benjamin to Emily, told Lucy to stay on her spot by the stove and not move, and followed Gideon's lead, without needing to be told twice. They brought the goat into the barn. They reinforced the barn door with the extra timber leaning against the south wall. They carried in enough firewood to last 3 days. They did all of this in under 90 minutes, working side by side in the kind of wordless coordination that usually takes people years to build. And when they came back inside and Gideon pulled the door shut against the first serious gust, Charlotte realized they were breathing in the same rhythm. She moved to the stove. He moved to the window. Neither of them said anything about it. The storm hit just after dark, and it was bad. Not the worst Gideon had seen on Bitter Peak. He said that once quietly, more to himself than to anyone, but bad enough. The wind found every gap in the logs that the summer had opened up and pushed cold air through in thin, insistent streams, and Charlotte stuffed those gaps with strips of cloth and spare wool and anything else she could find while Gideon kept the fire, and Lucy sat in her corner, watching the ceiling with enormous eyes. "Is the cabin going to fall down?" Lucy asked. "No," Gideon said. "How do you know?" "Because I built it." Lucy considered this. "Did you build it good?" "Good enough," he said. Lucy decided this was satisfactory and went back to watching the ceiling. Benjamin slept through the first 3 hours of it, which Charlotte took as either a blessing or a sign that something was wrong with him, and she checked him every 20 minutes with her hand against his forehead, until Emily said very gently, "Mama, he's fine. You can stop." And Charlotte realized her hands were shaking with something that wasn't cold. It was the second day of the storm that Benjamin's temperature changed. Charlotte noticed it the way mothers notice things, not from touching the automatic constant contact of a woman who has been calibrating her infant's body heat by instinct for 3 months. She was nursing him at dawn, and she felt it, and her whole body went quiet, in the particular way it does when alarm hasn't fully arrived yet, but is already on its way. She didn't say anything at first. She finished feeding him. She laid him down and put her lips to his forehead, which told her more than her hand did, and what her lips told her made the alarm arrive. Gideon. He was at the table with the almanac open, not reading it, just having something to do with his hands. He looked up at her tone immediately. "What?" "Feel his forehead." He was across the room before she finished the sentence. He put the back of his hand to Benjamin's head, held it there, looked at Charlotte. "How long?" "Just now. Maybe an hour, maybe since last night. I don't know." "How high does it feel to you?" "High enough," she said, which was the honest answer, and they both understood it. The medicine chest had willow bark and nothing else useful. Gideon went through it twice, as if something might appear on the second look. It didn't. He closed it, stood up, and said, "There's a doctor in Hatchet Creek. That's 12 miles south. The storm is letting up on the south face. I can get through." Charlotte looked at him. "Gideon, if the trail is iced." "I know the trail." He was already pulling on his coat. "Keep him warm, not hot warm. Willow bark and water as cool as he'll take it. Small amounts often. "I know," she said. "I know you know." He stopped at the door and looked at her, and his expression was the most direct it had ever been, stripped of the careful flatness he usually maintained. "I'll be back before dark." He left before she could say anything else. Emily appeared at her shoulder. "He's going in the storm." "I know, because of Benjamin." "Yes." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll boil water," and went to the stove, and Charlotte held her son against her chest and listened to the wind and counted the minutes. By mid-morning, Emily's cough started. Charlotte heard it from across the cabin and felt the floor shift under her. Emily never got sick. In 8 years of winters and wet springs and every illness that had passed through their household, Emily had gotten sick exactly twice, both times mildly, both times briefly. She had the constitution of something built to last. So when Emily coughed and Charlotte heard the particular quality of it, the depth of it, the way it came from the chest rather than the throat, she set Benjamin down carefully and crossed the room and put her hands on her daughter's face, and Emily looked at her with clear eyes and said, "I'm fine." "You're not fine." "I'm fine enough to help." "Emily." "Mama." Emily looked at her steadily. One thing at a time. Charlotte looked at her daughter. Her 8-year-old daughter with Thomas's jaw and nobody's eyes, who had been handling things with that particular steadiness since before she had any business knowing what steadiness was, and felt the familiar combination of fierce pride and heartbreak that had been Emily's specific gift to her since birth. "Sit by the fire," Charlotte said. "You help me from there." Emily sat by the fire. She helped from there. She talked Charlotte through everything she could remember about Benjamin's feeding schedule and sleep patterns in the last 48 hours, organized by time with the precision of a child who had been paying attention when adults thought she wasn't. It was useful, and Charlotte told her so, and Emily nodded as if that was the obvious expected outcome. Lucy sat in her corner and sang to herself quietly, the fragment of a song Charlotte didn't recognize, and the cabin held against the wind, and Benjamin burned. Gideon came back at 4 in the afternoon, not before dark, but close enough, and he was not alone. Charlotte heard the horse first, and was at the door before it opened. Gideon came through it with snow on his shoulders, and a woman behind him, small and gray-haired with a black bag, and the brisk movements of someone who had been called out in bad weather before, and had no patience for being made to feel bad about it. "Mrs. Abbott," Gideon said. "She's the doctor. His wife is—" the woman said, already moving toward the bed where Benjamin lay. "I'm better. He'll tell you so himself." She sat down and opened her bag, and Charlotte stepped back because this woman had the kind of presence that told you to step back. "How old? 3 months? How long the fever? Since this morning, maybe earlier." Mrs. Abbott's hands moved over Benjamin with practiced economy. She took his temperature with a glass instrument, checked his breathing, pressed gently on his abdomen. Benjamin fussed, and she said, "I know," to him in a tone that brooked no nonsense, and he subsided, apparently also understanding that tone. Charlotte was watching her hands and not breathing. "Croup coming on," Mrs. Abbott said finally. "Fever's high but not dangerous yet. I've brought what you need." She was already measuring something from a dark glass bottle. "You caught it early. Another day without treatment, and we'd be having a harder conversation." Charlotte sat down on the edge of the bed, because her legs suggested it was time. "He'll be all right." "If you do what I tell you, yes." Mrs. Abbott looked at her over Benjamin's head. "You the mother. Yes. You look like you haven't slept in a week." 2 days, Charlotte said. Same thing at this point. The older woman glanced at Emily by the fire, quick and professional. "That one's got something in her chest, too." "I know. I'll leave enough for both." She looked toward the door where Gideon was standing with his back against the wall, in the particular way he stood when he was trying to take up less space than he actually occupied. "Your husband rode through the South Pass in that weather, iced over in 2 places. He's not my—" Charlotte started. "He could have lost the horse on the second switchback," Mrs. Abbott said, as if Charlotte hadn't spoken. "He knew that before he went." Charlotte looked at Gideon. He was looking at the floor. "I'll need somewhere to sleep," Mrs. Abbott said. I'm not going back in the dark. The loft, Charlotte said automatically. Emily, can you? I'll take the barn, Gideon said, and went back outside. Charlotte looked at the closed door. He knew about the switchback. He had known before he left. He had looked at her and said, I'll be back before dark and gone anyway, knowing the trail was iced in 2 places. Knowing the storm wasn't fully done. Knowing the risk the same way he knew everything on this mountain completely and precisely and without making a performance of it. And he had not said a word about it. Mrs. Abbott was watching her face. The older woman had the eyes of someone who had been in enough rooms with enough people to know what she was looking at, and she said nothing. Just handed Charlotte the medicine bottle and the instructions, and Charlotte took them, and her hands were steady, because she would not let them be anything else. Benjamin's fever broke near midnight. Charlotte knew the moment it happened, because he stopped the small, restless movement that had occupied him for hours and went slack and easy in her arms, and she put her mouth to his forehead, and the heat was down unmistakably, the terrible trapped heat releasing like a door finally opened, and she closed her eyes and pressed her lips there and stayed like that for a long time. When she lifted her head, the cabin was quiet. Mrs. Abbott was in the loft. Lucy was in the bed turned on her side with one fist under her cheek. Emily was asleep in the chair by the stove tipped sideways, the willow bark instructions still in her hand. Charlotte carried Benjamin to the window and looked out at the barn. The light was still on inside, a thin line of it under the door. He was awake. She stood there for a long time. In the morning when Gideon came in, Charlotte was at the stove. She turned when she heard the door, and before he could say anything or ask anything, she said, "He's better. The fever broke." Gideon's whole body did something she didn't have a word for. Not relaxing, it was more like the thing that happens when a structure that's been under load for a long time is carefully relieved of it. It was brief, and he controlled it fast, but she saw it. "Good," he said. "Mrs. Abbott says Emily's chest needs watching for another week, but she should be fine." "Good," he said again. Charlotte turned back to the stove. She said without looking at him, "The South Pass, the second switchback." He was quiet. "Mrs. Abbott told me," she said. "She wasn't trying to, she was just saying." "It was manageable," he said. "You knew before you went." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Charlotte stared at the pot on the stove. Her throat was doing something she didn't give it permission to do. She kept her voice even with the particular effort of a woman who has had years of practice keeping her voice even, and she said, "You could have told me. You would have told me not to go." "Yes," she said, "I would have." "And I would have gone anyway," he said. "So I didn't see the point in the argument." Charlotte turned around and looked at him, and he met her eyes with the steady directness that she had come to understand was just his face. Just how he looked at things he was being honest about. And she thought about that road in the dark, and the iced switchback, and a man who had known and gone anyway, and not made a single word of it. She had been looking for the hidden thing, the cost, the condition. She found it now, but it was nothing like what she had expected. It was not cruelty. It was not possession. It was not the thing that lived in Clyde Mercer's eyes. It was this. A man who would ride an iced trail in the dark for a baby that wasn't his, and not tell her because he already knew what she would say, and he was going anyway. That was the thing that was hidden in him. That was what lived under the flat voice and the careful stillness and the 10 years alone on a mountain. And Charlotte Hayes had been a widow for 6 weeks and a guest in this man's cabin for 3, and she was not going to stand here and cry about it. So she turned back to the stove and stirred the pot and said very quietly, "Don't do that again without telling me." Pause. "All right," he said. "I mean it." "I know you do." She heard him sit down at the table. She heard the familiar sound of the chair finding its angle and his hands on the wood surface and the small creak the table made. When he leaned on it, sounds she had been hearing every morning for 3 weeks and had stopped noticing, which meant she had started expecting them, which was its own kind of information she was not ready to process before breakfast. Mrs. Abbott came down from the loft, took one look at the two of them, said, "Good morning," to the room in the tone of a woman who had read the room completely and was choosing to say nothing about it, and asked if there was coffee. There was coffee. The three of them sat at the table with the children still sleeping, and the storm fully gone outside, and the light coming through the east window, clean and new, and nobody talked about the switchback or the fever or anything that had happened in the dark, and it was the most ordinary morning Charlotte could remember having in a very long time. That was the thing about Gideon Blackwood she was learning. The extraordinary things he did quietly, and by the time you understood the weight of them, he had already moved on to the next ordinary thing. She was still watching him, but she had stopped looking for what was wrong. She was starting carefully, slowly, the way you start something you know you can't take back. She was starting to see what was there. And that afternoon, when Clyde Mercer's man rode up the Bitter Peak Trail with a folded paper in his hand, Charlotte was standing in the doorway when he arrived, and Gideon was standing beside her, and the man on the horse looked at both of them, and then at the paper in his hand, and then back at them and said, "I got a legal notice here for a Charlotte Hayes." Charlotte held out her hand. Gideon didn't move, but she felt the change in him, the particular stillness that was not stillness at all, but everything compressed and waiting. She took the paper. She read it. Hargrove's secondary claim had been filed in territorial court. They had 30 days to respond, or the judgment would be entered by default, and Hargrove's attorney was requesting the court order. Charlotte Hayes returned to Red Creek for the duration of the proceedings. She folded the paper. She looked at the man on the horse. "Tell whoever sent you," she said, "that we received it." The man looked at Gideon one more time, then turned his horse and went back down the trail. Charlotte stood in the doorway with the folded paper in her hand and the clean morning air on her face, and 30 days sitting on her chest like a stone. And Gideon said from beside her, "I already wrote to Billings." "I know." "If the letter got through before the storm." "I know," she said. She didn't move. He didn't move. 30 days. Somewhere down that mountain, Clyde Mercer had just reminded her that nothing on Bitter Peak was finished yet, that the auction block had a long memory, that $47 and a territorial court order could reach further than she had let herself believe. She had been starting to see what was here. Now she remembered what was still out there. She turned back inside. She put the notice on the table. She went back to the stove, and she stood there with her hands flat on the edge of it, and she thought about her children, all three of them, and she thought about 30 days, and she thought about a man who rode an iced road in the dark and didn't tell her. Then she straightened up. "Tell me about the man in Billings," she said. And Gideon sat down at the table and started talking. The man from Billings arrived on a Tuesday 12 days into the 30 they had been given. His name was Caleb Frost, and he was not what Charlotte had pictured. She had imagined someone impressive, tall, polished, carrying the particular authority of a man who had made his living bending the law in the right direction. What arrived instead was a slight man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and a traveling coat that had seen better years riding a mule with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly how good he was and had stopped needing to look it. He tied the mule at the post, came inside, accepted coffee, set his bag on the table, and said to Charlotte without preamble, "Show me everything you have." She showed him everything: the original debt documents, the auction receipt, the county transfer of labor liability, the secondary claim filing, the court notice. She had organized them in order of date, which she had done the night before without being asked, and Frost looked at the stack and then at her and said, "You did this yourself?" "Yes." "Good." He pulled the first document toward him and started reading. Gideon stood near the door in his usual position, the one where he was technically in the room, but taking up as little of it as possible, and Charlotte sat across from Frost and watched his face and tried to read it. His face gave nothing. He read the way someone eats methodically without performance, consuming each page and moving to the next. Emily sat at the end of the table with her hands folded. She had asked to stay, and Charlotte had let her because Emily would remember everything she heard and forget nothing, and that had value. After 20 minutes, Frost set down the last page, picked up his coffee, drank from it, and said, "The secondary claim is built on a misreading of the 1885 territorial statute. Intentional misreading, I'd wager. but a misreading. The labor provision allows transfer of liability in full at auction under county authority. They did it right. Hargrove's attorney is arguing that the provision only applies to voluntary auction, and that since you didn't sign the original labor bond yourself, your husband did the transfer is incomplete. Is that argument valid? Charlotte asked. In 3 territories it might be. In Montana, it isn't. There's a precedent from 1882 out of Helena that covers it exactly. He tapped the table with one finger. The problem isn't the law. The problem is Hargrove's attorney has already gotten a sympathetic ear in the Red Creek court, and a sympathetic ear in a local court can do a lot of damage before anyone from outside corrects it. So what do we do? Gideon said from the door. Frost looked at him. We file a counter-argument in the territorial court in Billings, which supersedes the local court on debt liability matters. That pulls the case out of Red Creek entirely. He paused. But I need 2 things first. I need the original deed to the Hayes property because there's a question about whether the land transfer was properly recorded, and if it wasn't, Hargrove's claim has a second prong we haven't dealt with yet. And I need to know if there were any witnesses to the original debt negotiation between Thomas Hayes and Hargrove. Charlotte's hands went still on the table. The deed, she said, was in the county records office in Red Creek. The room went quiet. Was, Frost said. When I tried to get a copy 6 weeks ago, the clerk told me it had been misfiled and couldn't be located. She kept her voice level. I assumed it was incompetence. Frost and Gideon looked at each other, and the look between them told Charlotte that neither man thought it was incompetence. The deed gets misfiled, Gideon said, and his voice had gone to the particular flatness that she knew now meant controlled anger, right after Thomas dies, and Hargrove starts making claims. That's a pattern I've seen before, Frost said without apparent emotion, the way a doctor says I've seen this before, not resigned, just honest. It means someone in that records office is working with Hargrove, or is afraid of him, and it means we need the deed from somewhere else. He looked at Charlotte. Was there another copy? Any other documentation of the land purchase? Charlotte thought. She thought hard. She went back through every piece of paper she had ever seen in her married life, and then she stopped. The church, she said. Reverend Elkins witnessed the original land purchase when we first moved to Red Creek. Thomas asked him to. He may have kept a copy in the church records. Can we get to Elkins? Frost said. He's in Red Creek, Gideon said. Which means someone has to go down the mountain. Another silence. I'll go, Charlotte said. Both men looked at her. I'll go, she said again. Elkins knows me. He'll give me a copy if he has it. And I need to be the one who asks, because it was my husband who asked him to witness it. That connection matters. Hargrove's people are in Red Creek, Gideon said. I know that. Mercer is in Red Creek. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. Are you going to tell me I can't go? A beat. No, he said. Good. She looked at Frost. What else do you need? Witnesses to the debt negotiation. Martha Greer, Charlotte said immediately. She was at the Hayes house the afternoon Thomas signed. She brought a pie. She didn't leave before Hargrove's man produced the documents. She saw. Will she testify? If someone asks her, right, Charlotte said. She's 64 years old, and she is afraid of Hargrove, and she is also the most stubborn woman in Red Creek County, and she liked Thomas, and she does not like what happened at that auction. She paused. I can ask her. Frost nodded slowly. He looked at Gideon again. You understand what this means. She goes into town, Hargrove will know. The 30-day window closes in 18 days. If Mercer decides to move before we can file in Billings, he won't move while I'm with her, Gideon said. You can't be with her every second. I can be with her enough seconds to matter. Charlotte looked at Gideon. He was looking at Frost, and his jaw was set in the way it set when he had made a decision, and the conversation about whether he'd made it was already closed. She recognized that jaw. She had her own version of it. Then it's decided, she said. We go tomorrow. They went the next morning, leaving Emily in charge of the cabin with instructions a locked door, and the understanding that Emily was the only 8-year-old Charlotte would trust with those particular responsibilities. Lucy cried at the door until Charlotte promised to bring her something from town, a promise Charlotte intended to keep regardless of how the rest of the day went. Benjamin was well enough now the croup had cleared, his color was good, and Charlotte had arranged with Mrs. Abbott, who was still in the valley, visiting her sister, to look in on the children by midday. The ride down was tense in the quiet way tense things are when you understand them too well to pretend. Charlotte rode. Gideon walked beside the horse, which he always did, which she had long since stopped arguing about. Frost rode his mule. Nobody talked much. The mountain had its own sounds. Red Creek in the morning looked the same as it always had, and nothing like how she remembered it. The auction platform was still there in the square, which she had not expected to matter, and which mattered enormously. She looked at it once and looked away, and did not look at it again. The church was first. Reverend Elkins was in the vestibule sorting hymnals when Charlotte came through the door, and when he looked up and saw her, his face did the thing faces do when guilt and relief arrive at the same time. He set the hymnals down. "Charlotte," he said, I heard you'd gone up the mountain." "I did," she said. "I need to ask you something, Reverend." She asked him. She asked him plainly, no softening, no approach from the side, the way she had learned some men needed. She asked him directly, because Elkins was not a dishonest man, just a frightened one, and frightened honest men respond to directness better than to strategy. He went to the back room. He was gone for 4 minutes, which was 3 minutes longer than she wanted. When he came back, he had a folded document in his hand, and a look on his face that she recognized the look of a man who has been carrying something he shouldn't have been carrying, and is relieved to put it down. "I kept a copy," he said. "I wasn't sure I told myself it wasn't my place, but I kept it." He held it out. "I'm sorry it took this long, Charlotte." She took it without making him feel better about the apology, because she didn't have that in her at this particular moment, and she said, "Thank you," and meant the thank you, if not the absolution, and she left. Gideon was outside the church door. She held up the document, and he nodded once. The small, compressed acknowledgement that meant everything he wasn't going to say out loud. Martha Greer lived on the east end of town, in a house that announced her personality. Before you reached the door. Everything ordered. Everything intentional. The garden weeded right to the fence line with the precision of a woman who believed that the state of your yard was a moral position. Charlotte knocked. Martha opened the door, looked at Charlotte, looked at Gideon, behind her, looked back at Charlotte and said, "I wondered when you'd come." "You knew I'd come. I knew somebody had to eventually." Martha stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll put coffee on. Leave the mountain man on the porch if he doesn't mind." Gideon didn't mind. He sat on the porch steps, and Martha shut the door, and Charlotte sat across from her at a kitchen table that smelled like bread and decades of cooking, and Martha said, "Tell me what you need," Charlotte told her. When she was done, Martha sat with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on the middle distance, and Charlotte waited, and the waiting was the hardest thing she had done since the auction platform, because this was the piece everything else depended on, and Martha Greer was the only person in the world who could give it to her. "Hargrove's a powerful man," Martha said finally. "I know. His attorney sent a letter to the Minister's Council 2 weeks ago, suggesting that anyone who interfered with the legitimate collection of lawful debt would be seen as obstructing county business. She said it the way you say something that tastes bad. 2 of the council members stopped speaking to me after I told them what I thought of that letter." "Martha, I saw Thomas sign that document," Martha said. "I saw what Hargrove's man told him before he signed it. Told him it was a short-term arrangement, 6-month standard terms, that the property was just a formality that would never be exercised." Her jaw tightened. Thomas believed him because Thomas was a decent man, and decent men sometimes cannot imagine the kind of person who would lie that specifically. Charlotte's throat closed. She pressed her lips together and held. "I'll testify," Martha said. "I'll put it in writing for your attorney, and I'll stand up in whatever court he needs me to stand up in." She looked at Charlotte steadily. A woman and her children were put on an auction block in the middle of this town because a man lied to her husband and then worked with a county clerk to erase the evidence. I have been sitting with that for 6 weeks, and I am done sitting. Charlotte reached across the table and took Martha's hand and held it for a moment. Just held it, and Martha let her. When they came out of the house, Frost was standing with Gideon on the porch, and both men looked at Charlotte's face, and Frost said, "She'll do it." "She'll do it," Charlotte said. Frost allowed himself a small exhale. "Then I have what I need. I can file in billings by end of week." It should have been the end of it for today. They should have ridden back up the mountain with the deed and Martha's promise, and 16 days still left on the clock. Charlotte was already thinking about the children, about Emily's face, when they got back about the promise of something from town for Lucy. That was when she heard Clyde Mercer's voice behind her. "Well now," he said, "didn't expect to see you back in town so soon." She turned. He was standing in the middle of the street with 2 men she didn't know on either side of him, and he had the look of a man who had been informed of their arrival and had arranged himself accordingly. He was smiling, which was always worse than when he wasn't. "Mercer," Gideon said. Not loud, just his name stated. "Gideon!" Mercer looked at him with the careful assessment of a man who respected the danger, but had decided he had enough backup not to show it. "You know there's a court notice outstanding for this woman. Technically, seeing as she's here in the county, I'd be within my rights to bring her to the court officer. She has legal representation," Frost said from beside Charlotte. He produced a card from his coat pocket with the practiced efficiency of a man who kept them ready for exactly this moment. "Caleb Frost, Territorial Bar Billings. Any action against my client prior to the Billings court date will be considered interference with an active territorial proceeding. I'll have an injunction filed before sunset." Mercer looked at the card. He looked at Frost. He looked at Gideon. He smiled again, slower this time. "You got yourself quite a team here, Charlotte." He said her name the way he said it, the particular use of it that meant something she had always hated. "Don't think this is over." "I don't," Charlotte said. He looked at her, and his smile was still there, but his eyes weren't smiling, and she held his gaze and did not move and did not look away. And after a moment, he turned and walked away with his men unhurried, like a man saving the rest of his moves for later. The street was quiet. Charlotte became aware that her heart was going very fast, and her hands were absolutely still, which was a combination she had gotten practiced at. "That went better than it could have," Frost said. "He's not done," Gideon said. "No," Charlotte said. "He's not, but neither are we." She looked at Frost. "File in billings, as fast as you can." "I'll ride tonight," Frost said. They rode back up the mountain in the long afternoon light. Charlotte had found a smooth blue stone in the churchyard, round and perfect, and she had it in her coat pocket for Lucy. She held it as she rode, and thought about Mercer's eyes and Martha's hands, and the deed folded safe in Frost's bag, and she thought about 16 days. Gideon walked beside her as he always did, and after a long silence he said, "You did well today." She looked down at him. "We did well today." He accepted this. "Yes." Another silence, a better silence, the kind that meant something. "Gideon?" She said it, and then paused, because the next part needed to be said right, and she was choosing the words. When this is over." She stopped, started again. "When this is settled. I want to talk about what happens next. Not today, but I want you to know I intend to have that conversation." He looked up at her. The late light caught his face, and he was quiet for a moment, and she could see him receiving what she'd said and deciding what to do with it. "All right," he said. 2 words, just 2 words. But the way he said them, level certain, no hesitation, was the same way he said everything he actually meant. And Charlotte faced forward again, and put the stone back in her pocket, and felt something in her chest do something she had not let it do in a very long time. Not hope exactly. Or maybe exactly hope. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. The cabin came into view in the last of the daylight lamplight in the window, Emily's silhouette moving behind the glass, and Charlotte thought about tomorrow and Billings and Mercer's careful smile, and a territorial court and everything still unfinished. And she thought about what came after unfinished. She thought about that the whole rest of the way home. Frost filed in Billings on Friday. Charlotte knew because he sent a rider up the mountain Saturday morning with a single folded note that said, "Filed. Hearing set for the 14th, 12 days." She read it twice, put it in her coat pocket next to the smooth blue stone she kept forgetting to give Lucy, and went back inside and made breakfast, and did not say anything to anyone until Emily looked at her face and said, "Good news or complicated news?" "Complicated news that's trying to be good," Charlotte said. Emily nodded. "Those are the best kind eventually." 12 days. Charlotte put them in her chest like stones and carried them. The first 4 passed quietly, in the way that things pass quietly when everyone in a house understands that something is coming and has collectively decided not to talk about it every minute. Gideon worked the property harder than usual. There was wood to split a section of fence on the south pasture that needed resetting the barn roof that had taken damage in the storm and had been waiting. Charlotte watched him from the window, sometimes not long, just the way you check on something you've started to rely on without meaning to. He worked like a man, burning off something he couldn't say out loud, and she understood that because she was doing the same thing just with bread dough and mending, and the particular focused fury of a woman cleaning things that didn't need cleaning. On the 5th day, Lucy gave Gideon her rock. Not the blue stone Charlotte had brought from Red Creek, that one she kept for herself, turning it in her pocket with the determined proprietary attachment of a 5-year-old. The original rock. The gray one with the white quartz vein that she had been carrying since the 3rd day on the trail and had shown him at the woodpile and reclaimed and kept in her dress pocket every day since. She walked up to him while he was washing his hands at the pump and held it out. He looked at it. "That's your best rock," he said. "I know," Lucy said. "You can have it." He crouched down. "Why?" Lucy thought about this with the serious face she used for important questions. "Because you keeped us," she said. "That's what it's for." Gideon looked at the rock in his palm for a long moment. His jaw moved once. Then he closed his hand around it and said, "I'll keep it safe." "I know," Lucy said, satisfied, and went back inside. Charlotte had seen it from the doorway. She went back to the stove before he could turn around and find her watching, and she stood there with her hands on the cast iron and her eyes closed for 10 seconds, just 10. And then she opened them and kept cooking. Some things were too full to look at directly. You had to let them sit in your peripheral vision and trust they were real. On the 7th day, Mercer made his move, and it was not what any of them had expected. Gideon came in from the south fence in the early afternoon, and Charlotte knew immediately from his face that something had happened. He had the compressed look, the jaw, the eyes that were doing all the work his expression wasn't doing. He put his hat on the table and sat down and said, "Ryder came up the trail while I was at the fence, from Hargrove's attorney." Charlotte set down what she was holding. "What did it say?" He put a paper on the table. She picked it up and read it, and the words arranged themselves in front of her in an order she had to read twice before she believed them. Hargrove's attorney was not just pursuing the secondary debt claim. He had filed an additional motion arguing that the presence of the Hayes children in the household of an unmarried man with no legal relationship to their mother constituted grounds for welfare removal under the 1886 Territorial Child Protection Statute. He was requesting the court appoint a county guardian for Emily and Lucy pending resolution of the debt proceedings. Charlotte set the paper down on the table very carefully. She did not pick it up again. "He's going after the girls," she said. "That's the new angle," Gideon said. "The debt case is weakening, and he knows it. So he's opening a second front." "A county guardian means Red Creek," Charlotte said. "It means someone Hargrove controls." "Yes." She looked at Gideon. He was looking at her with the direct, unguarded expression he used when he had already decided something and was waiting for her to catch up. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "There's a way to remove the child welfare argument entirely," he said. If you have a husband, a legal one. The motion argues the children are in an unsuitable living arrangement. A married household removes that argument. The cabin was very quiet. That's a legal strategy, Charlotte said. Yes, he said. Is that all it is? He was quiet for a moment. His hands were on the table flat the way they were when he was being precise about something. No, he said. It's not all it is, but I'm telling you about the legal part first because I think you'd want to know that part is real and not invented. Charlotte looked at him for a long time. Gideon, she said, I told you on the trail coming back from Red Creek that I wanted to have a conversation when this was settled. I remember. This isn't settled. No, he said. But if we wait until it's settled, it might be too late for the filing to help. She stood up and walked to the window and stood there with her back to him, not because she needed to think about what she felt. She had known what she felt for at least 2 weeks and had been extremely disciplined about not examining it too closely, but because she needed to think about what was true and what was right, and whether those two things were the same thing here. Emily appeared at the top of the loft ladder. She had been up there reading or pretending to. I heard, she said. I know you did, Charlotte said. Is it a bad thing that the solution to the legal problem is also... Emily paused, choosing words with her particular precision. Is it bad that it's also what you wanted anyway? Charlotte turned around and looked at her daughter. No, she said. I don't think it is. She looked at Gideon. He was looking back at her in the way he looked at things. He was being completely honest about that direct, steady look with nothing behind it except exactly what it was. We'd need to send for the Reverend, she said. Elkins owes you a favor, he said. He owes me several. I'll ride down and get him tomorrow morning, Gideon said. He paused. If that's what you want. It's what I want, Charlotte said. For all the reasons, not just the legal ones. Something moved across his face. Not the edge of a smile this time. The real thing, brief and true, and changing his whole face for the 5 seconds it lasted, and then it was gone. But Charlotte had seen it, and she thought she would be able to remember it with precision for the rest of her life. All right, he said. All right, she said. Emily descended the loft ladder, walked to the stove, and put the kettle on with the air of someone attending to practical matters following a settled question, which was exactly what she was doing. Lucy came in from outside a minute later, looked at the three of them, sensed something had shifted, and said, What happened? We're getting married, Charlotte said. Lucy looked at Gideon. Are you going to be our papa? Gideon looked at Charlotte, a look that asked a question and gave her the answer at the same time. And Charlotte nodded, and he looked back at Lucy and said, If you'll have me. Lucy considered this for approximately 1 second. Yes, she said with the decisive finality of someone closing a transaction they'd been anticipating. She went back to her corner by the stove. Can we have biscuits? Yes, Charlotte said, and her voice only broke slightly on the word. Elkins came up the mountain the following afternoon and married them in the cabin with Emily and Lucy as witnesses, and Benjamin propped against Emily's arm, watching the proceedings with the focused attention of an infant encountering something new. Elkins was brief and genuine, and Charlotte thought she saw him exhale something he had been holding since the auction. Some weight of his own failure that the ceremony was partly releasing, and she let him have that because she was in the business of releasing things today. Gideon held her hand through it with the same steadiness he did everything, and when Elkins said the final words, he looked at her with the direct, clear expression that meant he knew exactly what he was doing and had decided it fully, and she looked back at him the same way. After Elkins left, Emily made biscuits because Charlotte's hands were doing something that made careful cooking difficult. And they had a meal that nobody described as a wedding supper, but everyone understood was one. And Lucy sang the fragment of her song, and Benjamin fell asleep in Gideon's arms, between the main course and the end of the meal, and Gideon held him with the careful, deliberate ease of a man who has decided he is allowed to do this, who has given himself permission and means to keep it. Charlotte watched him hold her son and thought I was looking for the hidden thing for 2 months, and this was it. Not a cost, not a condition. Just a man who had been alone so long he had forgotten he was allowed to want anything, learning one small thing at a time that he was. 3 days before the hearing, Frost sent another writer. The note this time was longer. Charlotte read it at the table with Gideon beside her and Emily leaning in from the other side, and the important paragraph was the third one. Frost had filed the counter-argument. He had included the church deed, Martha Greer's signed testimony, and the Helena precedent. He had also, and this was the part that made Charlotte's breath stop, uncovered something in the county records that Hargrove's attorney had not anticipated: a second transaction document recorded under a different file number that showed Hargrove's agent had represented the original loan as non-secured, which meant Hargrove had committed fraud at the point of origination, not just aggressive debt collection. Fraud. The debt claim wasn't just weak, it was built on a crime. "He's finished," Gideon said, quiet. "Not until the judge says so," Charlotte said, because she had learned not to call things finished before they were. "No," he said. "But he's finished." She read the paragraph again. Then she put the letter down and said, "I need a minute," and went outside and stood in the cold morning air and breathed and let herself feel the full size of what had been chasing her for 2 months, and then let herself feel it getting smaller. And when she came back inside, her face was wet in a way she didn't try to explain to anyone. Nobody asked her to. The hearing in Red Creek was set for Tuesday. Not Billings. Frost had arranged a special session of the Territorial Circuit Court to sit in Red Creek, which meant the case would be heard under territorial authority, in the town where the wrong had happened, and Charlotte thought that was exactly right. They rode down together. All of them. Gideon and Charlotte and Emily and Lucy, with Benjamin in Charlotte's arms. Frost met them at the edge of town. Martha Greer was already inside the courthouse, sitting in the front row with her hands folded and her back straight, and the expression of a woman who has decided to do a thing and is done deliberating about it. Charlotte had expected the hearing to be long. It was not long. Frost presented the deed. He presented Martha's testimony. He presented the Helena precedent. He presented the fraud documentation. Hargrove's attorney objected twice and was overruled twice, and after the second overruling, he seemed to understand which direction the day was going, and his objections became less frequent. The circuit judge was a woman from Miles City, which Charlotte had not expected, and she had the brisk, thorough manner of someone who had been sent to find the truth and had no interest in anything that wasn't it. She asked Frost 3 questions. She asked Hargrove's attorney 2. She asked Charlotte 1. "Mrs. Blackwood," the judge said, "in your understanding, was the original debt negotiated honestly?" "No, Your Honor," Charlotte said. "It was not." The judge looked at her for a moment, then wrote something down, and Charlotte thought the writing itself was the decision that the question and her answer and the writing were one continuous thing. "The secondary claim is dismissed," the judge said. "The child welfare motion is dismissed in light of the recent marriage and the absence of any legitimate basis for the original claim. The court finds probable cause for fraud in the origination of the underlying debt and refers the matter to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for review." She looked at Hargrove's attorney. "Your client should retain counsel for that proceeding. He will need it." She closed the folder. It was over. Charlotte sat in the courtroom after the judge left and listened to the sound of it being over, and found that it didn't sound like anything in particular. Just the ordinary sounds of a room, people moving chairs, scraping the creak of the wood floor. And she thought, this is what the end of something terrible sounds like. Like nothing. Like ordinary air. Gideon put his hand over hers on the bench between them. She turned hers over and held it. Mercer left the courtroom without speaking to either of them, moving with the careful economy of a man conserving himself for whatever he was planning to do with the new information that his position in this town had just changed. Charlotte watched him go and thought, he is not done. Some men never are, but he is smaller now and we are not, and that difference matters. Martha Greer hugged her in the lobby, hard and brief, and said, "Go home, Charlotte. The way you say, go home to someone who has earned the word." Frost shook Gideon's hand and said, "You have a good wife." And Gideon said, "I know that," with the plain certainty of someone stating a thing they intend to keep knowing, and Frost smiled for the first time Charlotte had ever seen and went to find his mule. Outside the courthouse, Emily took Lucy's hand, and Lucy took the blue stone out of her pocket and looked at it and put it back, satisfied with its continued existence. And Emily looked up at Charlotte and said, "Can we go home now?" Home. Charlotte looked at her daughter and at the word she had used without thinking. The word that had quietly somewhere between the auction platform and the mountain trail, and a cabin with one bed and a barn and a cast-iron stove, and a man who slept outside so her children could sleep. Warm, the word had moved, had reattached itself to a new place without asking permission, the way real things do when they are ready. "Yes," Charlotte said, "we can go home." They rode back up the mountain in the afternoon light, all of them together, and when the cabin came into view, Lucy started to run the last 50 yards, and Emily followed because she was 8 and could. And Charlotte and Gideon rode the last stretch in the particular easy silence that meant everything between them was accounted for, and nothing needed to be added right now. At the door, Gideon stopped and looked at her, the way he had looked at her at the auction directly. Clearly nothing performed, and she thought about that first day in Red Creek, a woman on a platform holding her son looking at the mountains, because the mountains didn't ask anything of her. And a man on a black horse who had thrown down his last gold for 4 strangers because he knew what waited for her at the bottom of the alternative. She thought about everything that had happened between that moment and this one. "Back at that auction," she said before he could say anything. "Did you know that it would become this?" He was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet. "No," he said. "I knew I couldn't leave you there. That's all I knew." She looked at him. "That was enough," she said. "That was the right thing to know first." She went inside. He followed. And on Bitter Peak, in the last of the autumn light, in a cabin that had been cold and empty for 10 years, the sound of children and the smell of bread and the warmth of a fire, built by a man who had finally come home to a family he had not known he was waiting for. All of it settled into the walls like it had always been there, like it had been waiting, like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. Some families are made by blood, and some are made by choice. And the ones made by choice, made by a man who says, "I'll take them when the whole world is walking away," made by a woman who keeps watching until she finds what is true. Made by children who give their best rocks to the person who earned them. Those families are not lesser for the making. They are truer. They are harder won. They are built on the specific, irreplaceable foundation of someone deciding on purpose every single day that this is where they belong. Gideon Blackwood had ridden down off a mountain for supplies and ridden back up with a family, and every day after that for the rest of his life he would choose them again. And that, in the end, was everything.